Well, hello everybody. My name is Kwa. Once again, it is me who will be guiding you through this final lesson in neuroanatomy. And today, what we're going to learn about is that we're going to learn lesson 5, which is the autonomic nervous system and conduction pathways. Now, there are only two contents within this lesson. Number one, we will be doing the autonomic nervous system. This is the nervous system that basically controls things in your body that your somatic nervous system, like your thoughts, for example, cannot control. Like, for example, you can control using your thoughts whether you move your hands in this fashion. But the thing that you cannot use your thoughts to control is whether you will be using your heart and beating your heart like, with more force or not, or beating it faster or not, right? That you cannot use your thought to do that. You cannot use your thought to tell your heart to beat faster or beat slower, right? That cannot be done. And therefore, those actions, like for example, the beating of the heart, okay, the movement of the GI tract, like for example, peristalsis, those are going to fall into the jurisdiction of what is known as the autonomic nervous system that we have already alluded about in previous lessons already, but we will be going into it in more detail today in this neuroanatomy lecture. And then finally, we will go into the conduction pathways and we will learn somewhat of some major conduction pathways within the human nervous system. The pathways that are for sensory processes, like for example, how does touch, pain, and temperature get from peripheral tissues, like for example, your hands, all the way to your brain so that it can be decoded and essentially processed within the central nervous system. And we will also look at motor system, basically how signals get from your brain all the way down to your muscles, for example, in order to produce movements of the body. And so those are going to be our two main contents today. Okay, so first content is that we are going to go into the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system will consist of axons or nerve fibers from the central nervous system to smooth muscles, like the glands, the blood vessels, the organs, and cardiac muscle. And one of the things that student usually doesn't get right is that they think that the autonomic nervous system is going to act independently of the central nervous system. That is not correct. Okay, the autonomic nervous system will also receive control from the central nervous system via a very important center within diencephalon, aka the hypothalamus. From there, from the hypothalamus, from the anterior and posterior nuclei of the hypothalamus, there will be branches that goes through the brainstem down to your spinal cord to control your sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Specifically for the sympathetic nervous system here, you will have a tract right there on the lateral side, right there of the spinal cord, especially the cervical spinal cord, and every single section of the spinal cord that contains sympathetic nervous system, like for example the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord, like for example the thoracic region and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. You will have this tract right there. That tract is called a hypothalamo-spinal tract. And what it does is that in this tract there will be axons, and those axons will carry signals from the hypothalamus down and synapse with the outflow for the the outflow of the sympathetic nervous system right there on the lateral horn. Okay, so yes, so one thing that you do need to remember is that like the autonomic nervous system will also receive input from the central nervous system for it to work. Okay, very important. Okay, so now what are the divisions of the autonomic nervous system? How is the ANS divided? Okay, I call the autonomic nervous system the ANS, okay, because that is the abbreviation of it. And so because of it, how does the ANS divide it? Okay, we can divide the ANS into three branches. Branch number one is the sympathetic nervous system, and this branch has the jurisdiction of ruling over fight or flight situations. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. Okay, and now the second branch is the parasympathetic nervous system. This branch is all about rest and digest. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system is involved with situations when you are under danger. For example, when you are running away from a dog that's chasing you, or when you are exercising, something along that line. Okay, like maybe like when you are going out into the sun, and like there's something that causes you to run. You're running from danger, or you're fighting from danger, or you're fighting the danger. Okay, so that would be the jurisdiction of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. Okay, now for the parasympathetic nervous system, it's all about when the danger has passed. Okay, and you are in a position that you can rest, or you can begin to eat. And when you begin to eat and when you begin to drink, eventually those food and the fluids that goes into your body will have to get out somewhere, right? So digest and even urinary functions, excretory functions, things like that. Okay, so now there is a third branch of the autonomic nervous system, namely the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is not discussed in this lesson, but remember back when you were learning about the digestive system, right? You still remember that in the digestive tract, there are 4 layers, right? You got the serosa outside, then you got the muscularis, then you got the submucosa, and in the most layer is going to be the mucosa, right? So within the muscularis layer, within the middle of the longitudinal muscle layer on the outside, as well as the circular muscle on the inside, there is a nerve plexus. And that nerve plexus is the myenteric plexus of Albach. Okay, and then within the submucosal layer, you have the submucosal plexus of Meissner. So those two plexuses combine in order to form the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system will be involved in self-regulating the functions of a gut tube, okay, in terms of movements of the gut tube, like peristalsis or secretory functions, okay, with the mucosa layer. Okay, like for example, the secretion of mucus or something like that will be under the jurisdiction of the enteric nervous system. Okay, so now we will not talk about the enteric nervous system within this lesson because it's only involved within the digestive tract, but we will be talking about the structures of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system within this lecture. And what you need to know is that at most organs, there is going to be what is known as dual innervation, which means, like, for example, if you have, like, the salivary glands right here, the parotid gland right here, the submandibular gland, the sublingual gland, they will receive control from both the sympathetic nervous system as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so that is what is known as dual innervation. Okay, so now let's say, for example, the heart. The heart also receives sympathetic input and parasympathetic input. Sympathetic input tends to make the heart beat faster. Okay, it tends to increase the heart rate, while the parasympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic input to the heart tends to slow it down, decrease the heart rate. Okay, so you got dual innervation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic at most organs, but they usually run in reverse with each other. Okay, with some exceptions. Okay, with some exceptions. Okay, but anyway, let us go to the first branch now. Okay, the first branch now, which is the sympathetic nervous system. Or actually, before we do that, let's go to some of the overall structures within the entire autonomic nervous system. Okay, so now there are some peripheral structures that we will learn about in this lesson, and all of this will become much more easy. Okay, the more and more you go into this lesson, so bear with me for these first couple of slides. Okay, it will become much clearer when we go into the actual structure of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. But for both of the SANS and PANS, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic, there are ganglia. Okay, there are ganglia. And now, what is a ganglion? A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies of neurons, okay, outside of the central nervous system, and that is a ganglia. Okay, so for both of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, you still got ganglia. Okay, and now there are different types of ganglia. Really depends on which system you are talking about. Like, for example, you got the paravertebral ganglia. Those are 2 chains of ganglia, also called the sympathetic trunks, okay, that runs alongside of your vertebral column. So imagine if you have your vertebral column like this, right? So your vertebral column is like this. In between the vertebrae, you have, like, the IV disc and whatever, okay? But this vertebral column will be divided into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and finally coccygeal. Okay, so that will be your vertebral column. Okay, so imagine this. On both sides of the vertebral column, there will be a chain of ganglia. Okay, so you will see that there are two lines, but in the midst of those two lines, there will be ganglia that goes up and down those two lines. Look at that. So you have those two lines, but those two lines are not straight lines running up and down. They are punctuated by ganglia, okay, at certain segments. So you will see that there are ganglia along those two lines. You see that? Okay, so imagine that situation is going to go down like that, okay, for the entire length of the vertebral column. And each of them is going to be called the sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk. Okay, so we have two sympathetic trunks, one on the left side, one on the right side, and they run parallel on either side of the vertebral column. Okay, and another name for these sympathetic trunks and these ganglia, another name for these ganglia right there, we will call them the paravertebral ganglia. Okay, why? Because they are parallel to the vertebral column. They are very close to the vertebral column. They're running parallel to the vertebral column, so paravertebral ganglia. Okay, so essentially that's that. Okay, so now another one of the ganglia that is also involved within the sympathetic nervous system is going to be the prevertebral ganglia. What does that mean? So that means that besides from these two sympathetic trunks that runs on either side of the vertebral column, sometimes from these sympathetic trunks, branches will arrive, right? That goes anteriorly, right? Anteriorly. And they usually go to a location that is anterior to the aorta, mostly the abdominal aorta, okay? And there, at the front of the aorta, like for example, this is the aorta, right? They will go to the front of the aorta. And at the front of the aorta, what is going to happen is that there will be ganglia at the front of the aorta like this. Okay, these are nervous ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system as well. Okay, and so these guys are going to be called the prevertebral ganglia. Okay, the prevertebral ganglia. Okay, prevertebral ganglia. And now, there are three groups of these prevertebral ganglia that you do need to know. And each of these groups corresponds to the three main arteries that feed the digestive system. Okay, remember those three arteries? You have the celiac trunk, right? Then you have the superior mesenteric artery. And then you have the inferior mesenteric artery, right? Now, for these prevertebral ganglia, some of them will be very close to the celiac trunk. Okay, some of them will be close to the superior mesenteric artery. Right? They will be coming from, like, for example, these branches here. Yep, these branches here are going to get the branches to these prevertebral ganglia that are very close to the superior mesenteric artery. And then finally, you will also have these ganglia here, also have branches from here that are very close to the inferior mesenteric artery. Okay, so there are three groups of prevertebral ganglia that I want you to get to know the name of. Okay, number one are the celiac ganglia. Okay, the celiac ganglia. Okay, and then you have the superior mesenteric ganglia, and then you have the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Okay, so now these names should be very self-evident for you. Okay, you will know immediately their location upon reading those names, simply because of the fact that they will be close to the main arteries that we have already talked about when we learned about the digestive tract. Okay, but now let me tell you something more. These branches right there, okay, these branches right there that are going to the celiac ganglia, okay, like for example, this is the celiac ganglia, right? These branches that go to the celiac ganglia, usually they make one trunk, okay, they usually make one trunk, so they don't go as three separate branches like this, but they go like this, okay, so this is the sympathetic chain, right? These are some of the ganglia associated with the celiac ganglia, right? So there will be branches from these guys there, the paravertebral ganglia, and they will make one trunk, and that one trunk is going to go to the celiac ganglia. And that one trunk there that goes to the celiac ganglia, we call it the greater splanchnic nerve. Greater splanchnic nerve. Okay, greater splanchnic nerve. Then, how about these branches here that form trunks to the superior mesenteric ganglia? You will call that the lesser splanchnic nerve. Lesser splanchnic nerve. Okay, and then finally, you have these branches here that will give out branches to the IM, to the inferior mesenteric ganglia. And what do you call that? The least splanchnic nerve. Okay, the least splanchnic nerve. Okay, so we'll have branches going to the celiac ganglia, greater splanchnic nerve. Branches go to the superior mesenteric ganglia, lesser splanchnic nerve. And finally, branches going to the inferior mesenteric ganglia, least splanchnic nerve. Okay, make sense? All right, so let's go on. So we have paravertebral ganglia and prevertebral ganglia. These are both ganglia from the sympathetic nervous system, or SANS. Okay, now for the parasympathetic nervous system, or PANS, they will not be paravertebral ganglia or prevertebral ganglia within the PANS, but they will be ganglia like the terminal ganglia and the intramural ganglia in the PANS. The reason why, we will talk about that later. Okay, but just know that the terminal ganglia and the intramural ganglia are exclusively for the PANS, the parasympathetic nervous system only. Okay, now next up, besides from these autonomic ganglia, you also have autonomic nerve fibers or autonomic axons. These autonomic axons are of two varieties. Okay, coming out from the spinal cord, you have preganglionic fibers and you got postganglionic fibers. Why? Because of this. Imagine, imagine this is your spinal cord, right? This is your spinal cord right there. Okay, 1 second here. There we go. Okay, now the spinal cord will have a couple of segments, right? So you have cervical segments, you got thoracic segments, you got lumbar segments, you got sacral segments, and then you have one coccygeal segment. So now, from the thoracic segment, you have one neuron going out of the thoracic segment. Okay, usually that is of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar system. Thoracolumbar system. Why? Because the cell bodies of the outflow of this SANS always come from these two segments of the spinal cord, the thoracic segment and the lumbar segment, okay, and nowhere else. So that is why the sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar system. Now, so what does that have to do with pre- and postganglionic neurons? Let me tell you. So now here, look. From the thoracic segment, right, you got a cell body of one neuron of the sympathetic nervous system going out. Okay, this is only the first neuron in a chain. Okay, when it goes out like this, it is going to synapse with another neuron. Okay, that neuron is over here. And where these two synapses, there is basically a ganglion. Okay, that ganglion is a sympathetic ganglion. Okay, this is a sympathetic ganglion, also called SANS ganglion. Okay, and so because of that, what do you think this fiber should be called? Yes, it should be called a preganglionic neuron. Okay, preganglionic neuron. And that fiber that is going to go out from this ganglion to the target cell, right? For example, this is the target cell. Let's say it is an SA node cell of the heart. Okay, SA nodal cell of the heart, right? Then that will be one of the target cells in the body of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now what do you think this neuron should be called? That neuron that goes from the ganglion to the target cell, what should that be called? Yes, the postganglionic neuron. Okay, postganglionic neuron. Okay, so yes, so you have preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron going to SA nodal cell. Okay, SA nodal cell. So now that is a sympathetic nervous system. How about the parasympathetic nervous system? Parasympathetic nervous system is also called craniosacral. Okay, craniosacral. Okay, craniosacral outflow. Why is it called a craniosacral outflow? Because the origins of the fibers, okay, the preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system can originate two places. Okay, above the cervical spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. Above that, there's the pons. Above that, there's the midbrain. And those are collectively known as brainstem. Okay, so from a brainstem, we have cranial nerve number 3. Okay, cranial nerve number 3, right? Cranial nerve number 3 has the job of controlling the extraocular muscles, but it also controls the intraocular muscles. Remember the ciliaris, okay, as well as the sphincter pupilli. How? By parasympathetic output, okay, parasympathetic input. So that means that number 3 can have parasympathetic fibers within them, okay? And then what else do we have? We also have parasympathetic fibers from the 7th cranial nerve, right? From the 7th cranial nerve. The 7th cranial nerve will have parasympathetic fibers that goes to the lacrimal gland up here, right? The submandibular gland and the sublingual gland. So what is that? It is another type of parasympathetic output, right? And then after that, we'll have number 9. Okay, number 9. Cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 9 will get parasympathetic fibers to increase the secretion of the parotid gland. So it is also a parasympathetic neuron. Okay, a parasympathetic collection of neurons. Okay, and then finally, you have number 10. Number 10 is very special. Okay, number 10 is very special. Number 10 is the vagus nerve, right? The vagus nerve is the major parasympathetic nerve for not only, okay, the thoracic organs, but also the abdominal organs, right? As we have already learned in the lessons in the digestive system, okay? The vagus nerve, or the cranial nerve number 10, is a nerve that comes all the way from your medulla oblongata, but it goes down to supply parasympathetic fibers to the organs within the chest, as well as the organs within the abdomen. Okay, so this ranges very far and very wide. Okay, so imagine one of these fibers from cranial nerve number 10 is going to go like that, okay, towards the SA nodal cell. Then it's going to synapse, and that synapse is going to continue with a postganglionic fiber to the SA nodal cell. Okay, so look, so what would that be called? What would this one be called? Is it the preganglionic or postganglionic? Preganglionic, okay, preganglionic parasympathetic neuron. Okay, this one is preganglionic sympathetic neuron. Okay, and that is postganglionic sympathetic neuron. Okay, and that one right there, preganglionic what? Parasympathetic neuron. All right, how about this one? That is postganglionic parasympathetic neuron. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that for both of these systems, the sympathetic as well as parasympathetic, they're all going to have preganglionic parasympathetic neuron, and they're also going to have postganglionic parasympathetic neuron. Okay, but they're just different. They are just different in where they go out of. Okay, so SANS, or sympathetic nervous system, is the thoracolumbar system, which means that the cell body, okay, of the preganglionic neuron or the sympathetic system will go out from these two segments, thoracic and lumbar of the spinal cord, while the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons will have the cell body at the cranial, aka the brain, right, cranial segment, and the sacral segment from S2 to S4. Okay, so S2, S3, S4. So you have S2 here, S3 here, and S4 here. Those are the bodies of preganglionic parasympathetic neurons that goes out from these three segments, mostly going to provide parasympathetic input to organs of the pelvis, as well as descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rest of the digestive tract after that. Okay, so remember, the SANS, okay, or sympathetic nervous system, is going to be thoracolumbar, while the PNS is going to be craniosacral. Okay, very, very important that you remember that. Okay, now dual innervation, right? Dual innervation means that they are going to innervate the target cell differently. So for postganglionic sympathetic neuron, what it will do is that it will release a neurotransmitter that is norepinephrine, and norepinephrine is going to increase the heart rate, right? But for the postganglionic parasympathetic neuron, what it will do is that they will release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine will do what? decrease the heart rate. Okay, so this is what is known as dual innervation, guys. So most of the organs in our body will have dual innervation between ANS and PANS. And at most of these organs, the effect of those two are going to be in reverse. Okay, for most. There are some exceptions, but for most, it is the case. Okay, and one more thing in this. The length of the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron within the ANS and the PANS are not the same. Okay, as you can see here, for the ANS, okay, the preganglionic neuron, is it short or long relative to the postganglionic neuron? It's short, right? This one is very short, right? How about the postganglionic neuron? It's very long, right? So it's different, okay? So in the ANS, the preganglionic neuron is short, while the preganglionic neuron is long. While the preganglionic parasympathetic neuron, how is that compared with the postganglionic one? It's longer, right? It's very long, while the postganglionic is very short. Now, when I say the postganglionic parasympathetic neuron is short, it's an understatement. Okay, why? Because sometimes this ganglion is going to in the parasympathetic nervous system only. Okay, this neuron sometimes can lie mere centimeters away from the target organ, or sometimes they will be within the target organ, which means that this ganglion sometimes can be centimeters from the target organ, or it can lie within here, right, within the target organ itself. So now, what would happen if the ganglion lies here, very close to the target organ? We will call that a terminal ganglion. Terminal ganglion. Okay, a terminal ganglion. While if the ganglion lies within the walls of the target organ itself, you call it the intramural ganglion. Okay, intramural ganglion. Why intramural ganglion? Intra means within, mural means wall. This ganglion lies within the wall of the target organ. Okay, parasympathetic nervous system only, guys. So terminal ganglia and intramural ganglia only happens within the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember that. Okay, very, very important. So in both of the parasympathetic and sympathetic, you will have preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. Okay, now sometimes as these sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers goes near their target, sometimes there will be plexuses that are formed. Okay, like for example, you will have the esophageal plexuses, mostly from the branches of the two like the two vagus nerve. Okay, go to the esophagus and innervate the esophagus. Okay, with parasympathetic fibers, because vagus nerve parasympathetic. Okay, but in most of these plexuses, okay, the cardiac plexus, okay, the esophageal plexus, the pulmonary plexus, even the plexus within the abdominal cavity, like the superior mesenteric plexus, the celiac plexus, as well as the inferior mesenteric plexus, usually, okay, the fibers of this parasympathetic nervous system is going to be, just making a network like this, and then sympathetic fibers also go into that network. So within that network, autonomic network, it will have fibers on both parasympathetic as well as sympathetic as well. Okay, so yes, autonomic plexuses usually will contain both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, and they intertwine before entering the target organ, so that the target organ will have a dual innervation of parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, yes, very good. Okay, so now this is the difference. What we have said before, okay? So for parasympathetic and sympathetic, remember the differences lie in number one, the length of their preganglionic fibers versus postganglionic fibers. Okay, the type of neurotransmitters that they release at the target cell. Okay, and of course the positioning of their ganglia. Okay. So if you remember that from the previous image that we have already drawn out, you would have a very good grasp on the structure of these two systems. Okay. Very good. Okay, so now let's go deeper into the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now structure, like we have said before, structure of the sympathetic nervous system is what? Thoracolumbar. So you will see that in the spinal cord, The two segments that are going to give the origin to the sympathetic nervous system preganglionic neurons are going to be from T1 to L2, thoracolumbar. Okay, T1 to T12 and then L1 and L2. Those are thoracolumbar segments. So now let us go to see how the sympathetic nervous system is actually structured within the body. And this is going to be a wild ride. Okay, so join me please. Now, first off, let's draw out some structures here. First off, let's draw the brain first. Many people, they forget that even though these systems are mostly functioning with the outflow of the spinal cord as well as the brainstem, the brain, the higher centers within the brain also control, okay, the activities of these systems as well. So we need to draw out the brain first. Okay, always we need to draw out the brain first. Okay, so that's the brain. Now, within the brain, there is this area right there that is the diencephalon, right? That's the thalamus. Then you have going down for the thalamus is a center, right? What do we call that center again? Hypothalamus. Very good. So remember, hypothalamus is a center over here that can modulate the function of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. There will be centers called the anterior and posterior hypothalamic nuclei that are going to control the activities of the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. But I don't need you to know that right now. Just know that the hypothalamus controls the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and that will be good enough for me. Okay, so now right here, I am going to kind of just at the foramen magnum. I think I'm just going to turn the spinal cord a little bit. Okay, so the brain is going to face this way, right? But now I'm going to turn the spinal cord a little bit so that the cord appears straight from up to down. Okay, so here we have a little bit of a turn in the spinal cord, right? Okay, definitely not something physiological, but like, you know, this is something that we need to do for the sake of illustration, essentially. So you got the spinal cord here, right? From here all the way to here. Okay, then the spinal cord will contain what? Number one, cervical. Number two, thoracic. How many segments of the thoracic, guys? 12. Very good. So then you have lumbar, and then you have sacral, and then you have one coccygeal segment. Now, T is thoracic, right? L is lumbar. So where is the outflow? Where is the outflow of the sympathetic nervous system going to be? Thoracolumbar. T1 through L2. Very good. So the outflow is going to be from here all the way to around here, right? T1 to L2. Okay. So what happens at T1 to L2? Let me show you. Look, if I were to draw out a segment of the spinal cord right here, let's call it segment T2. Okay. So what happens at segment T2? Here. Let's see. Here, this is segment T2, right? The spinal cord always have a posterior median fissure, okay? A posterior median sulcus, okay? And the anterior median fissure, okay? Here is the central canal, right? This is the gray matter, okay? This is the gray matter, which have a shape like an H or a butterfly, okay? And it's in the middle, and the white matter is outside, okay? So this is the orientation of one very, very simple segment of spinal cord, okay? But we are talking about T1 to L2. So we need to change a little bit within the illustration. How? Here, look. We are going to have to remove this part and this part. And we need to add another horn into it, okay? So now, normally, if you are not at any segment from T1 to L2, the gray matter of the spinal cord only contains two horns, okay? The posterior horn and the anterior horn, okay? Or the dorsal horn and the ventral horn, right? But in T1 to L2, something very remarkable happens. You will have an extra horn of the spinal cord right there. What is that horn called? The lateral horn, okay? Also called the intermedial lateral horn, okay? But usually I just call it the lateral horn for the sake of brevity, okay? So that it's a little bit shorter to say, okay, rather than intermedial lateral horn. That's a mouthful, okay? Just say it's lateral horn, okay? So now, from the lateral horn, what happens? When you have a lateral horn, you must know that the cell body of sympathetic neurons originate there. So this is one cell body, and this is another cell body on the other side of a sympathetic neuron, Okay, so the cell body of sympathetic neuron is going to be there. But remember, the hypothalamus also send down, okay, neurons to innervate and control the outflow of the sympathetic nervous system. So what would that look like? That would look like this. Okay, this is hypothalamus, right? From the hypothalamus, neurons are going to be sent down. This is a polysynaptic chain of neurons that will go down the brainstem, and then it will go down the cervical segment of the spinal cord, and then when it gets to the thoracic segment of the spinal cord, it will run on the two descending thalamic fibers here, what I have already shown you before, okay, shown you before in the previous slide. So it will run like this, down, and then after that, it will go inside here and synapse on that preganglionic body of the preganglionic neuron, like that. Okay, so that is how, this is the reason how the hypothalamus can control the outflow of the sympathetic nervous system through this. We call it the, I would say hypothalamo sympathetic system, or the descending hypothalamics, okay? Descending hypothalamics, okay? This is sympathetic nervous system related. And then after that, what you have? You will have the preganglionic neurons, right? The preganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons and the postganglionic neurons are called the outflow, okay? The outflow of the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So first, you have the preganglionic the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, and it's going to go out, right? But how does it go out? Not this way, not this way. It goes out like what? It will go out alongside. So let me just erase this one for a little bit. Okay, you know the descending thalamics, right? Descending hypothalamics, right? So now, the preganglionic neuron, okay, of the outflow of the sympathetic is going to go out like this. It is going to go with the anterior horn, okay? And the anterior horn is going to lead where? It's going to lead to the anterior root, okay? Which is the motor root, okay? The motor root that we have already talked about when we learned about the spinal cord. Okay, then this one here posterior is going to be the posterior or dorsal root, and we have the dorsal root ganglion, right? So now here, look, the anterior and the posterior root are going to fuse together, right? To make what? To make a spinal nerve. Okay, the spinal nerve will go through the intervertebral foramina, and then after that it will divide into the posterior or dorsal ramus, and then anterior or ventral ramus. Okay, so it's going to be like that. Now, when you have the spinal nerve right there, you see the spinal nerve right there, which is basically the fusion of two roots. The spinal nerve also have two other branches, okay? One branch here and one branch here. And these two branches are going to connect with one ganglion right there. And that ganglion is not alone, okay? But it will have a branch up there, and then there will be another ganglion up here. And then there's a branch up there that leads it to another ganglion. Another branch up here that leads it to another ganglion. Okay? And so you can imagine that if you have T2 here, for example, if you have T4 here, T4 is going to go like this. This one, sulcus, fissure. Okay? And then you have gray matter, lateral horn, right? Lateral horn like that. And then after that, you will have also the preganglionic neuron going out through there, okay? And then you have dorsal root or posterior root, anterior root, okay? And then you have the spinal nerve. And then the spinal nerve is going to also divide into the ventral ramus and the dorsal ramus. And then you will also have these two branches here that are going to have a ganglion here. And that ganglion is going to be connected to that ganglion like that, right? Right? Let's just say it's T3, so that the immediate, like, you know, so that, like, you know, this connection between them becomes immediate, okay? But this ganglion is going to attach with this ganglion like that. You see that? So what am I drawing here? What is this thing? What is this thing that goes up and down? A chain of ganglion. What is that? The sympathetic trunk. Yes, very good. So you will see the sympathetic trunk is basically the result of multiple sympathetic ganglia that are connected with multiple spinal nerves running up and down the spinal, vertebral column. Okay, so yes. Now, what are the names of these two branches? Okay, the name of that branch right there, we call it the white ramus communicans. Okay, right, the white ramus communicans. And then after that, you'll have another branch right here. You call it the gray ramus communicans. Okay, gray ramus communicans. Okay, so you have two rami communicantes. Okay, number one is white ramus communicans that is more laterally located, and then you have a gray ramus communicans that is more medially located. So now, what will happen with the sympathetic neuron here? It will go like that. It will go alongside of the motor neurons in the anterior root. And then after that, when it gets to the spinal nerve, something happens. It will go into the sympathetic ganglion like this. Okay? So it will go like that through the white ramus communicans into the ganglion of the sympathetic system in the sympathetic trunk. Okay? And now it can do some things. Okay? It can do some things. Very, very carefully. Look. The number one thing it can do is that it can synapse right here at this sympathetic ganglion. Okay? To make the postganglionic neurons, and the postganglionic neurons is going to go to the gray ramus communicans and then either go to the anterior ramus or the posterior rear ramus, depending on its location. Okay, depending on its location. But that is not the only thing that this preganglionic neuron can do. Okay, that is simply the first path. The first path is to synapse with a postganglionic neuron. Okay, but it will also have multiple other pathways that it can do. Number one, it can bypass the synapse here altogether. It doesn't do synapse, but what it will do, it will ascend up the cord here, and then it can synapse right here. Or it does not synapse right here, but it goes up here and then synapse right here. Okay, it can go like that. So it can, the preganglionic neuron can get into the ganglia and then ascend the cord. Okay, and then what do you think it can also do? Yes, it can also descend the cord to another segment down here and synapse there, right? Totally can do that. Okay, and then another fate is that it doesn't synapse here at all. It doesn't ascend the cord. It doesn't descend the cord. But remember when we said the splanchnic nerve. Remember the splanchnic nerve, right? Like for example, you have the splanchnic nerves right there, especially around T5, T6, T7, T8, T9 segments, right? There are a lot of these branches that eventually will become the splanchnic nerve, right? And then it's going to go into the splanchnic nerve right there, does not synapse at all, okay? And goes into the next part, which is what? Which are the ganglia that are going to be at the front of the aorta. Remember that? Remember that? Those ones? Those are called the prevertebral ganglia, and they can synapse there. Okay? Like for example, if this is a celiac ganglion, okay, it can synapse at the celiac ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron can go out to the organs within the abdomen. Like for example, the liver, like for example the hepatic plexus, the stomach. Okay, the stomach via the the plexus of nerves that are around the stomach. Then you can have the renal plexus that delivers sympathetic flow into the kidneys. Okay, they all should go through the pathway of the splanchnic nerve, then synapse at this prevertebral ganglia, and then get the postganglionic neuron to the target tissues. Okay, so now what is a splanchnic nerve? Essentially, the splanchnic nerve is a nerve that originates from branches coming from the paravertebral ganglia. Okay, so it's a nerve that originates from branches of the paravertebral ganglia. Okay, and they will go to where? To the prevertebral ganglia. And what type of fibers, what type of neurons are going to be contained within these splanchnic nerves? Preganglionic, not postganglionic, preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay, this is where a lot of people get it wrong. These splanchnic nerves do not contain the postganglionic neurons; they contain the preganglionic neurons. Okay, very, very important that you get this right. Okay, there's a lot of questions like this, especially on exams, on exams such as like, USMLE. A lot of these questions can be found within the BRS books. You do need to know this. Okay, so it contains the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay, so now there is one very special case. I think this is our fifth case, right? The fifth case is a very, very special case. How? There is a group of neurons that goes here, right? Still preganglionic neurons, but it doesn't synapse here at all. It doesn't synapse here at the prevertebral ganglia at all. It doesn't synapse here. And then it will go within the sympathetic plexus to where? Adrenal medulla. Remember, there is a gland right here. Okay, that is the adrenal gland of the kidneys. This one here, the part that is within here, is called the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla. Okay, and the adrenal medulla, what it is that it's not even a gland, guys. Adrenal medulla is not a gland. It is a big ganglion. Imagine, right? You got the sympathetic ganglion here like this, and a prevertebral ganglion here like this, right? So the adrenal medulla, you can think of it as another type of special ganglion of the sympathetic system that is here. Not here, not here, not here, but here. Okay, it's also a sympathetic ganglion. It's a special sympathetic ganglion that has been put there, right, in embryonic development very, very specially. Okay, and then after that, these preganglionic neurons going to the adrenal medulla, what will it do? It will stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine. Okay, around 80% epinephrine and around 20% norepinephrine. Okay, so our last case, which is our very super uber special case, is that the preganglionic neurons does not even synapse at the prevertebral ganglia at all, but it goes all the way to the adrenal medulla and synapse there. And when it synapses, it isn't synapsing with a postganglionic neuron, but instead it is going to control the adrenal medulla to release 80% epinephrine and 20% norepinephrine. Okay, extremely important bit of anatomy this. Okay, now we have already seen that, like, some of these fibers here, right? Some of these fibers here, especially from like, T1 and T2 and sometimes even C8, right? It will come from here, go to the anterior or ventral root, okay? Go to the white ramus communicans and then ascends, right? And then it will ascend the ganglia right here, right? But now, where will these fibers go? So, pay attention. The fibers coming from the preganglionic fibers, okay, preganglionic fibers coming from segments T1 and T2 and sometimes even C8 in some individuals, okay, will ascend the sympathetic trunk all the way to the uppermost ganglion, also called the superior cervical ganglion. Superior cervical ganglion. Okay, so for example, this is the middle cervical ganglion, and this is the superior cervical ganglion. These neurons will go all the way up here. Okay, from T1, T2, and sometimes C8. It will go all the way up here and synapse with the second neuron. And lo and behold, what does that second neuron go to? So now, remember what we said before about that the sympathetic nervous system is a thoracolumbar system, right? If so, have you ever wondered how does the head receive sympathetic input? Like, for example, the eyes also have sympathetic input. It has to have sympathetic input going to the salivary glands. They're all within the head, right? So how does the sympathetic system arrive there? Let me tell you. So at the superior cervical ganglion, the postsympathetic neurons are going to come out. And then what will it do? There is a special artery that goes from the underneath here all the way into the central nervous system. Okay? And what is that artery? The internal carotid artery on both sides, right? So you have two of these neurons, the postganglionic neurons coming from the superior cervical ganglion, and you have two ICAs. So what do? These neurons are going to make a plexus. surrounding the ICA and follow the ICA into the brain case. From the brain case, it can leave the branches to go to every single other places within the head and neck. Okay, so what do we call this one? You call this one a carotid plexus. Now, remember when you learn about the bones of the head and neck? You have to learn about, like, the foramina of the bones of the head and neck, right? You still remember the foramen that the ICA, the internal carotid artery, goes through? Yes, the carotid canal, right? Now, if you have another atlas, okay, then you will have a panel, an image that shows you which structure goes to which foramen and canal, right? If you look in the carotid canal, you will see two things passing through the carotid canal, not just one. One thing is the internal carotid artery. What is the other thing? Carotid plexus. What is carotid plexus? This thing. Okay, so the carotid sympathetic plexus does the job of getting the sympathetic outflow into the structures of the head and neck. Okay, so that is it's just magical, the way how our body is structured. It's just magical. Okay, but this is how your sympathetic nervous system is structured. Okay, so please do remember the complexity, because you will encounter that when you read about that in various textbooks when you go to clinical. And if you don't know how it is structured, you read that textbook and not understand a word of it. Okay, so yes. Okay, so yes, I think we have all already gone through all of this. Yes, so you can see here in this image, the two sympathetic trunks are going to go, like, on a parallel fashion, okay, up and down the two the two sides of the vertebral column. Okay, you will see here what we have talked about before. This is the inferior cervical ganglion. This is the middle cervical ganglion. This is the superior cervical ganglion. This is where the synapsing happens, so that the postganglionic neurons can go to the head and neck via the carotid. Via the carotid plexus. Then you will have these segments here, making the greater splenic nerve. Okay, and then you have the lesser splenic nerve, and then you have the least splenic nerve. Okay, all of those will contain preganglionic neurons. Okay, preganglionic neurons that has not synapse at the paravertebral ganglia, so that it can go to synapse at the prevertebral ganglion, the celiac ganglia, the superior mesenteric ganglia, and then the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Okay, so yes, essentially you will have a structuring of the sympathetic system just like that. Okay, so all of that we have already talked about before. Yes, very good. And yes, and finally, if you look very carefully within this image, and if somebody does not show you this, you will never find out, is that the preganglionic neurons are shown as dashed blue lines. Okay, the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetics are going to be shown as dashed blue lines, while the postganglionic are going to be shown as the continuous blue lines. Look at the line going into the adrenal gland here. Do you see any continuous lines? No. Why? Because the preganglionic neurons, one of the longest in the body, starts all the way from the thoracic segment of the spinal cord, running through the running through the paravertebral ganglia without synapsing, running through the prevertebral ganglia, the celiac ganglia in this case, without synapsing, and then arriving at the adrenal medulla. That is why you don't see it synapsing anywhere except going to the adrenal medulla. Okay? Very important point there. Very good. So now, yes, that's it, I think. Yes, I think that is it, essentially. Now, how about the parasympathetic nervous system? So, remember, the parasympathetic nervous system is what? Craniosacral. Very good. So now, we will go like this. Now, you will have the brain, right? You have the brain like that. Okay? The brain are going to have like the cerebrum over here. Then you have midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord. Right? Spinal cord. Right there. Okay, sorry about that. Let me just delete all of this. Very good. Okay, so let's just go make a little bit of a better spinal cord right there. Very nice. Okay, good. And then you have cerebellum here and here. Now, remember, up here, you have the thalami. Okay, and for the thalami down, you have the hypothalamus. Okay, and the hypothalamus is going to contain centers, the higher nuclei, that will send signals down, okay, to control the parasympathetic outflow down there. Okay, but then as it goes down, what we'll find, number one, the outflow, the first outflow of the parasympathetic, let's just do a little bit of a different color. Yes, let's do the green color here. First off, you'll have what? The nuclei of the third nerve, okay, the third cranial nerve, the oculomotor nerve, okay. And this nucleus here is called the nucleus of Edinger-Westphal, okay, which is the parasympathetic nucleus of third nerve, okay. Then it will make fibers that goes with the third nerve out, okay, so from both sides, okay. Let me just do one side, but I'm just going to draw the two third nerves in order for you to understand that both of these are going to be both-sided, okay. So you have this one here. That is going to be the parasympathetic going to the eyes to control the intraocular muscles, the ciliaris, okay, as well as the sphincter pupillae, okay. Yes. So let's go down here. So ciliaris, and sphincter pupillae, sphincter pupillae, okay. So ciliaris muscle and sphincter pupillae are going to be controlled by the parasympathetic fibers of the third nerve. Then what do we have down here? We have the seven nucleus, okay, the parasympathetic nucleus of the seventh nerve, and that parasympathetic nucleus of the seventh nerve is also called the superior salivatory nucleus, okay, superior salivatory nucleus. And from the superior salivatory nucleus, fibers are going to go out and go alongside of the seventh nerve, okay, the cranial nerve number 7, or more specifically, it will go alongside 7 prime, also called the intermediate nerve or nervus intermedius, okay. It will go alongside 7 prime, okay. So you'll have the fibers, the parasympathetic fibers from the superior salivatory nucleus going with the cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve, to innervate the parasympathetic function of what gland? The lacrimal gland, okay, as well as the let's say the submandibular gland, and sublingual gland. Okay, so that's 7, and then you have 9, right? Then you have 9. 9 should be right here, and the parasympathetic nucleus of 9 is also called the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, and so you will have fibers from there going into the parotid gland. Okay, parotid gland. Okay, and then finally you have 10. Okay, finally you have 10. 10 is going to go to thoracic organs, abdominal organs. Okay, thoracic organs, and then abdominal organs. Okay, thoracic organs and then abdominal organs. Okay, and supply them with parasympathetic input. And that nucleus right there with 10 that goes to and supply the parasympathetic sympathetic output to the thoracic organs, abdominal organs, it is called the dorsal vagal nucleus. Okay, so you have from these nucleus here in the brainstem, the output is going to go out through the third nerve, the 7th nerve or 7 prime nerve, the 9th nerve, okay, the 9th nerve, and finally the 10th nerve. Okay, and then it will go through all of these organs and supply all of these organs with parasympathetic output. Okay, and now it is important for you to understand that not only would supply parasympathetic output to these organs, it will supply other structures of the head and neck with parasympathetic output as well. These organs are simply the biggest organs that I want you to know. Okay, now, but we all know that this is not the end, right? Because what do we call the parasympathetic system again? The craniosacral. We are done with the cranial here. How about sacral? Okay, so now let's look. This is cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. Okay, so now sacral, there will be S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. Okay, so now from S2 to S4, which means from here to here. Okay, from S2 to S4, this is S2, S3, and S4. Okay, fibers are going to go out, and those fibers are going to supply mostly pelvic organs. Why? Because the 10th has already supplied most of the abdominal organs, except for the portion of the descending colon. Okay, a little bit of a portion of the splenic flexure, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. Okay, so most of the abdominal organs has already been innervated. So now S2, S3, and S4, what will they innervate? They will innervate. Okay, they will innervate mostly the organs of the pelvis. Okay, the organs of the pelvis. Okay, that's it. So we have the scheme of the parasympathetic nervous system is craniosacral. So we have cranial up here and we have sacral down here. You understand? Okay, so now let's talk about preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Okay, so now let's delete this. Okay, let's delete this. All of this actually. Yep, let's delete all of this. And we'll talk about preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. So now, let me ask you, what is the length of the preganglionic neurons versus postganglionic in parasympathetic nervous system? Preganglionic is going to be way longer, right? Yes, just like that. You will see that here, from the third cranial nerve, there will be a ganglion very close to the eyes. Let's imagine this is the eyes right here, and in the internal structure of the eyes, we will have sphincter pupilli as well as ciliaris muscles right here. Okay, so from this ganglion, postganglionic neurons are going to go, and they are going to go to these muscles. Okay, to these muscles right there. What ganglion is that? That ganglion is what is known as the ciliary ganglion. Okay, so ciliary ganglion is a parasympathetic ganglion. Okay, a parasympathetic ganglion within the head and neck. Okay, that's the first one. Then you have fibers from the superior salivatory nucleus going with the intermediate nerve or the facial nerve, and it will go and it will get to another ganglia here. Okay, another ganglia here and another ganglia down here. Okay, from this ganglia up here, parasympathetic fibers, postganglionic fibers, if you will, are going to go and innervate the lacrimal gland. So what ganglion is that? That ganglion is known as the pterygopalatine ganglion. Pterygopalatine ganglion. Pterygopalatine ganglion. And how about this ganglion over here? That ganglion right there is called the submandibular ganglion. And with the name such as submandibular ganglion, what do you think the postganglionic fibers are going to innervate? Yes, the submandibular gland. But that's not all. It also innervates the sublingual gland. So you have submandibular gland, right? And the sublingual gland. And the sublingual gland. Make sense? Okay. And then you will have from here, from the inferior salivatory nucleus, it will go down, right, to another ganglion right here, right? And from that ganglion, it will innervate the parotid gland, right? It will innervate the parotid gland here, parotid gland. So what is that ganglion? That ganglion is called otic ganglion. Okay, otic ganglion. Okay, and for the dorsal vagal nucleus is going to give out the preganglionic sympathetic fibers that is going to go down, and when it goes down, it begins to branch out. It branches out into so many branches. Some of them will go to the heart. Some of them will go to the the lungs. Some of them will go into for example, the esophagus, and then some of them will go into the stomach, the anterior and posterior vagal trunks, right? Some of them will go all over the places within the thoracic and abdominal cavity and supply parasympathetic to those structures. Okay, and so what you have to know is that these ganglia that postganglionic parasympathetic fibers arise from, they will collectively be known as intramural ganglia. Okay, all of these ganglia from here, 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 and here, as well as all of these from the sacral going to pelvic organs. All of these ganglia are also going to be known as the intramural ganglia. Why? Because they lie within the wall of the organ that they are going to innervate. So you can imagine the postganglionic neurons is going to be very short, like sometimes even millimeters short, or even less than that. Okay, because if you are already at the organ, then you don't have to have a long postganglionic fiber, right? So for example, this one goes to the heart, maybe this one goes to the lungs, maybe this one goes to the stomach, okay, maybe this one goes to the intestines, something like that, right? And after that, these goes to the pelvic organs, okay, pelvic organs, okay. So yes, that is how the preganglionic and postganglionic parasympathetic neurons are structured, okay. And now lastly, remember, we still have to have the input from hypothalamic neurons up here. So from the hypothalamus, okay, these neurons are going to go down like that on the sides of the brainstem and spinal cord. And then as it goes to the third nerve nucleus, give out a branch to innervate it. When it goes to the superior salivatory nucleus, give out a branch to innervate it. As it goes to the inferior salivatory nucleus, give out another branch, and so give out another branch, right? And so after that, it goes down to S1, S2, S3, and S4, and it's going to innervate S2, S3, and S4. And so because of that, the central nervous system, especially the diencephalon, are also going to have input to the parasympathetic nervous system as well. Remember, these two systems cannot work without central innervation. Okay, very, very important point there that a lot of people forget. Okay, so now finally we need to understand, when it is within the sacral cord, where is the location of the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons? Where is this within the spinal cord? We have already said up here that the cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to be here at the intermediolateral horn or lateral horn, right? So where are the bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system? Look, this is a sacral segment and this is another sacral segment. Okay, you will see that in the sacral segment there is something that is called an intermediolateral cell column, not intermediolateral horn. Okay, it's not a horn, it's just a cell column. Okay, and this cell column only is going to be present as S2, S3, and S4. Okay, so from this intermedial cell column, okay, the parasympathetic neurons are going to go out. Okay, are going to go out, and they are going to go out with the anterior root, just like we said before. Okay, so now, as you can see here, this is another image, right, that shows you different areas of the gray matter of the spinal cord. You will see that here there is a segment right there that is only present, okay, from T1 to L2, and that is the lateral horn. In this one, it contains the cell body of the preganglionic sympathetic fibers, while this area here, this is the intermedial lateral cell column, which is not the horn. Okay, this is not the horn. These two areas are not the same. Okay, this is the intermedial lateral cell column, and this is essentially the one where there is, like, you know, the cell body of the S2, S3, and S4. Okay, preganglionic neurons or the parasympathetic is going to go out. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see, intermedial lateral cell column. Yes. So remember, the lateral horn is only present from T1 to L2, and that's where the preganglionic sympathetic go out. And the intermedial lateral cell column is only present from S2 to S4, and that is where the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons go out. Okay, very good. And I think all of that is done. Yes. So all of these structures belonging to the ANS, I think I will give you some time to go back home and read about them, because they're not very important for you to understand the structures of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, right? And unfortunately, because, like, you know, this is the way how the book is structured, these structures are are kind of jumbled together. The sympathetic and parasympathetic are jumbled together. So it's a little bit hard to kind of distinguish between them. So I would say keep this as reference. But if you want to understand, right, understand the material, go back to what we have said before about the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay. Yes. Okay. So now in our last bit of the lesson, let's talk about conduction pathways. So now, conduction pathways can be two types of pathways. Number one, conduction pathways can be pathways that transport stimuli, like for example, hot, cold, pain, temperature, and sometimes even vision, olfaction, hearing, okay, taste, all of that, okay, those are stimuli from the periphery to the central nervous system, so that central nervous system can process this information. And that pathway, that type of pathway that goes from periphery to central is also known as sensory pathway. Another word that we can use to basically say the sensory pathway is afferent pathway. Okay, so the afferent pathway are more sensory, and they will get the sensations, okay, the stimuli from the sensations all the way from the periphery into the central nervous system so that it can be processed, okay? And now you have the reverse pathway, the pathway that transmits actions from the central nervous system, especially from different areas of your cerebral cortex, like the precentral gyrus, all the way to the periphery, to the motor neurons within the spinal cord, okay? You will call that the motor pathways. And another word that we can use to call the motor pathways are going to be efferent pathways. Okay, efferent pathways. So you got two types of pathways, the afferent or the sensory pathways and the efferent or the motor pathways. Okay, so those are the two pathways that we are going to look at today. So now let's look at sensory pathways first. Sensory are also afferent pathways, and it really depends on the types of sensation. We'll have different types of sensory pathways. Okay, so first off, let's just see how many sensations do we have. Number one, do you have the somato sensation? Somato sensation is a sensation that we will feel throughout your body. Okay, it's not special. Throughout your body, you can feel somato sensation. Okay, and so somato sensation can be something like, for example, you feel a pinprick on the tip of your finger. That is a somatosensor sensation. Okay, another one is when you can feel like, you know, whether like, you know, the ice cube that you put in your mouth, whether it's hot or cold. Okay, it's cold definitely, but that is another type of somatosensation, which is temperature. Okay, another somatosensation is that when you close your eyes, you can still feel the movement of your body. You can still understand where one of your joint is, like for example, where your left or your right elbow joint is. Okay, and that is another type of somatosensation that is called proprioception. Okay, so somatosensation can be divided into superficial sensation and deep sensations. Okay, I usually put them in air quotes simply because of the fact that this is the type of words that were used in the more older textbook, like the one that we have from, like, you know, in Vietnam, right? So most of the stuff that I tell you in these lectures will have to get its roots from Vietnamese textbooks. Otherwise, you get out there and you can't integrate with the society, and then it's my fault. Okay, so essentially all of these terms here are going to be translated with some discretion, okay, with some discretion and consultation with the English material from the Vietnamese material. So you have superficial sensation and deep sensation. So superficial sensation are going to be pain, temperature, and what is known as crude touch. Crude touch is light touch. So essentially, if somebody uses a feather to kind of tickle your skin right there, that's crude touch, that's light touch. Okay, so pain, temperature, and light touch or crude touch are going to be superficial sensation. And then for the deep sensation, we'll have the deep sensation from tendons and muscles telling you where your, like, you know, your right elbow joint is. Even though you are closing your eyes, you can still feel where your right elbow joint is. Okay, that is known as proprioception, and it is one of the most important deep sensations. Okay, so you have proprioception, and then you have sensation from internal organs, visceral sensations, and then you have what is known as fine touch. Like for example, somebody apply pressure onto your skin, you can feel that. That is fine touch. Okay, so light touch or crude touch is superficial sensation, while fine touch or pressured touch is going to be deep sensation. Okay, and why do we need to distinguish between superficial and deep sensations? Simply because of the fact that this uses one pathway and this one uses another pathway. So the pathways that conducts these sensations are not the same thing. Okay, they're not the same pathway. Okay, very, very importantly that you understand that. And then after that, besides from somatic sensation, we'll have also special senses like vision, sight, hearing, okay, smell, or taste. Okay, and those are going to be sensed by other parts, okay, by other parts, special parts of the body that we will not actually discuss within this lecture. Okay, so for the sensory pathways that we talk about in this lecture, most of them are going to be concerning with the somato sensation only. Okay, so let us go to superficial sensations. Okay, so what are superficial sensations again? Number one, pain, temperature, and light touch. Okay, pain, temperature, and light touch or crude touch. And now, what you need to know is that for both of the deep and the superficial sensations, there are always going to be a pathway of 3 neurons. Okay, 3 neurons that goes from the periphery all the way to your cerebral cortex. Okay, sometimes, like for example, in the BRS or the Costanzo physiology textbook, you will have a 4th order neuron. Okay, but we will concern ourselves with only these 3, 1, 2, and 3 neurons. Okay, because those are going to be the chain of neurons that eventually will lead your sensation all the way to the cortex. Okay, so now let us see how the neurons are going to be associated with the senses of superficial sensation. Now we have 3 neurons, right? You got neuron number 1. Okay, neuron number 1 is also called the 1st order neuron. 1st order neuron. Neuron number 2 is also called the 2nd order neuron. 2nd order, yeah, there should be a dash there. Very good. 2nd order neuron. And then finally, the 3rd neuron is also called the 3rd order neuron. Okay, so the 1st order neuron always going to go from the receptor in the periphery. Like for example, if you feel a pinprick over here and you feel pain, right? Where does that pain going to originate? It's going to originate at the nociceptors. The receptor that sends pain all the way here at the tip of your finger, right? From there, what will happen? There will be a 1st order neuron that goes from that receptor all the way back. And the 1st order neuron is going to go back. It's going to have a cell body right here. And this is the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, and so it goes back. It will have a central process that goes within the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord, something peculiar happens. Within the spinal cord, this 1st order neuron are going to go and synapse with the 2nd neuron right away. Okay, so this neuron, the 1st order neuron, is going to synapse very shortly in the superficial sensation. Superficial sensation, this 1st order neuron is going to synapse with the 2nd order neuron very shortly after it goes within the spinal cord. Okay, and then from there, the 2nd order neuron will immediately cross to the other side. Okay, before it does anything else, the 2nd order neuron will cross to the other side. And after it crosses to the other side, it will go up the spinal cord and go up the brainstem and go up to the thalamus. And then at the thalamus, it's going to synapse with a 3rd order neuron. Okay, at the thalamus, it's going to synapse with a 3rd order neuron. Oh, I'm sorry. The 3rd order neuron. I'm sorry. Very good. 3rd order neuron. And that 3rd order neuron is going to get the sensation all the way to your somatosensory cortex at the postcentral gyrus. Okay, so now this is the main diagram. But now let me just draw you another diagram that shows this in more detail. Okay, so imagine this is your finger, and at your finger there are receptors that senses pain. Now you have okay, a pin has pricked into here, so you feel pain now. Okay, so this receptor is going to pick up that pain, and if when it gets pick up that pain, the peripheral process of that 1st order neuron is going to go back. It makes a cell body here at the dorsal root ganglion, and then it will go back into the spinal cord. How? Here. This is the spinal cord, right? And in this spinal cord, like for example, this is the spinal cord, right? I'm just going to draw it out of proportion, right? And then you have brainstem, medulla, okay? Then you have pons, and you have midbrain up here, okay? And then you have cerebral cortex up here. Cerebral cortex there. Okay, and then you have the cerebellum, and in between that you got the diencephalon, which is the thalamus, and all the structures right there. We just draw the thalamus over there. Okay, now this is the first order neuron. This is a segment of the spinal cord, right? Gray matter, and then surrounding white matter. Where will this first order neuron go to? Okay, let me just erase this one because it's getting a little bit hard to see. Now, so yes, there. First order neuron is going to go like this. Cell body is right here at the dorsal root ganglion. Then the central process is going to go. And it's going to go into the posterior root. Okay, remember the posterior root has the dorsal root ganglion right here, right? And then it goes out and becomes like, the spinal nerve. See? So you have this neuron here, the first order neuron, is going to go into the dorsal root, and then it's going to synapse. If not here, then at the dorsal horn of the gray matter of a segment of a spinal cord above that. But let's say in this case that is synapse right here at the posterior horn right here. Okay, and the posterior horn is going to contain the cell body. Okay, the cell body of the second order neuron. So what will the second order neuron do? Immediately cross to the other side. Bam! It will cross to the other side like this. And after it crosses to the other side, it will go to a tract on the side of the spinal cord right here. That tract right there. Okay, that tract right there, that is going to lead the sensation all the way up there. Okay, that tract right there, following it, right? Following it to the spinal cord, that tract right there, we call it the lateral spinothalamic tract. Okay, and the lateral spinothalamic tract is going to be the one, right? Is going to be the one that is going to conduct the pain and temperature fibers. Okay, pain and temperature are going to go with the lateral spinothalamic tract. Now, some of you may say, what about the light touch? We're talking about pain here, but how about light touch? Like, for example, if you have a feather that is going to tickle you right there, the finger, what will happen? Then you'll have another neuron, which is this green neuron here that goes back, right? Also have a cell body here, the dorsal root ganglion, go back there, okay? Synapse with another neuron within the posterior horn of the gray matter. And then what? And then it's going to cross to the other side, just like that, but it will end up here. This is the tract that is going to conduct it upwards. And this tract is not called the lateral spinothalamic tract, but it's called the anterior spinothalamic tract. Okay, anterior spinothalamic tract. And this one is for crew touch. Okay, this one is for crew touch. Okay, so yes, so you have two tracts that is going to lead it all the way to the thalamus. And this is the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tract. These two are going to join together. Okay, these two are going to join together with another tract. And this joining over here at the brainstem, you call it the spinal lemniscus. Spinal lemniscus. Okay, and the fibers from the spinal lemniscus is going to go up here to the thalamus. Okay, to the thalamus. And they are going to synapse at the third order neuron at the thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus will contain the body of the third order neuron that goes from the spinal lemniscus up, right? So the third order neuron is going to go from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex. So it will go to the cortex like that. Okay, it will go to the cortex like that. And so will this green neuron. Okay, there will be a lot of neurons that goes to different places within the cortex. Really depends on which part of your body, okay, which part of your body is stimulated. Okay, like for example, if your finger is stimulated, it will go somewhere alongside here. Okay, it will somewhere alongside here. But if your legs are the one that is stimulated, it will go somewhere like here. Okay, if your legs is the one that's stimulated, it will go somewhere like here. Okay, so it's a oh wait, sorry. If your head is stimulated, then it will go somewhere like here. Okay, if your legs is stimulated, it will go somewhere like here actually. Okay, so it really depends on the on where. Okay, on where at the somatosensory cortex you you get stimulated, where in your body you get stimulated. It will go to a different part of the somatosensory cortex. And now, let me ask you, where is the somatosensory cortex? Look, this is your brain, right? This is the temporal lobe, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, right? Right here, okay? Cerebellum. And now, there is a sulcus right here that will divide the frontal lobe right here and the parietal lobe right here. Still remember its name? Yes, it is the central sulcus, okay? Central sulcus of Rolando. Now, this central sulcus will divide the frontal and parietal lobes, but there are two gyri. One in front of that, one behind that, okay? The one in front is also going to call the precentral gyrus, okay? The precentral gyrus, while the one posterior to the central sulcus is also called the postcentral gyrus, okay? Now, what you need to know is that this area here, which is the somatosensory cortex, right there, is the cerebral cortex of the postcentral gyrus. Okay, that one there and that one there is the same. Okay, that one there and that one there is the same thing. So that's what? That's the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, primary somatosensory cortex, and it's at the postcentral gyrus. Okay, postcentral gyrus. Okay, so yes, that is essentially the conduction pathways for superficial sensations. So we'll say superficial sensations here. Okay, superficial sensations. And now, let me see whether there's anything else. Yes, and yeah, that's it. Very good. So now we will go to deep sensations. Okay, up here is superficial sensations. So down here, we'll have another one for deep sensations. Okay, we'll have deep sensations. So what are deep sensations? So sensation from where? Sensations from your organs, so visceral organs. Sensations from your muscles and tendons. Okay, and muscles and tendons, they have a type of sensations called proprioception, so that you can sense where your body is and where every single part of your body is in space, even though you don't even open your eyes. Okay, now another one is going to be the sensations of fine touch, which is pressure touch. Okay, but all of those guys, all of those sensations, right, you can actually feel it, right? You can actually feel it. So you call that type of sensations, okay, that type of sensations the conscious, okay, conscious deep sensation, right? And there is another type of deep sensations called unconscious deep sensation. Okay, and in unconscious deep sensation, it is essentially a very, very special type of proprioception, but you don't sense it within the cerebral cortex because it sends the information somewhere else. Your cerebellum. Why? Your cerebellum is the center for coordination of actions. And the coordination of actions, like for example, if you were to pick up this bottle, you will need to know where your hand is before you pick up the bottle, right? And also where you should move your hand. And what are the degrees in which you should move your hand? Should you move your hand like this? Or should you move your hand slowly and controlled towards the bottle so that you can pick it up, right? So for those information, you don't need to know it within your cerebral cortex, but you need to know it in your cerebellum. But your cerebellum, when information is going there in the cerebellum is kind of like a computer. It will compute, right? It will compute the sensations that goes from, like, peripheral senses, like, tendons and muscles, so that it knows where each of the parts of your body is. Okay, but that information is not in the cerebral cortex, which means you cannot sense it, right? You cannot sense it. So that is called unconscious deep sensation. So these two only have one type of difference. For conscious deep sensation, it will go to your cerebral cortex. While unconscious deep sensation, it will go to your cerebellum. That is the only distinction between the two. Okay, so now let's regard ourselves with a conscious deep sensation, because this is the more important one. We need to know, right? We need to understand and know where each of the part of our body is in space. So now let's go. Cerebrum, okay, right there, okay, and then you have thalamus, okay, thalami, one here and one here. Then you have midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, And then finally, spinal cord. Okay, let's draw the spinal cord very, very small, except for a part of the spinal cord right here that we draw big simply for the sake of illustration, right? And then we'll draw a segment, okay, segment right there, the spinal cord right there. Then you'll have the dorsal horn and the ventral horn of the gray matter right there. You'll have the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root right there, ventral root right there, and then you'll have the spinal nerve. Okay, very good. Okay, so imagine if you, for example, if you have like, a sensation from one of your muscles, right? Let's say this is the biceps muscle. Okay, the biceps muscle are going to be contracting and not uncontracting. And when it is contracting and not contracting, information from that muscle are going to go from that muscle all the way back to the central nervous system, so that you know how it gets contracting. Where is the location of that muscles, and whether it is contracting much or contracting not much, just like a light contraction versus a heavy contraction. So how does that come about? So imagine in this muscle, there are sensory receptors, right? And those sensory receptors are going to give out fibers. Okay, sensory fibers that has a peripheral process that goes in a cell body right there, where dorsal root ganglion. That is why there is a ganglion there, you guys, because there's so many of these like, cell bodies of multiple types of neurons in there. So that's why there's a bulge there. That's called the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root or the anterior root does not have a ganglion. Why? Because motor neurons does not have a cell body that looks like this. Okay. So yes, so you have like, that first order neuron is going to go into your central nervous system, into your spinal cord. First off, the cell body is here at the dorsal root ganglion. Then you have a central process that goes into the spinal cord. And then when it goes into the spinal cord, what is going to happen is that it's not going to synapse right away. Okay, it's not going to synapse right away. Instead, it will get to, okay, I'm sorry, not here. It will get to here, this location right there, right? This location right there of the white matter of the spinal cord, and then go up. So all of this is first order neuron. So imagine the first order neuron of the superficial sensations will synapse immediately when it gets into the spinal cord. Okay, either at the level of that spinal cord segment or a little bit up from that. Okay, but this one, it doesn't do that. Okay, it will go first into this segment. Okay, this area here of the white matter of the spinal cord and ascend there. Okay, and that segment right there, actually that area right there of the white matter, we call it the dorsal columns. Okay, this term should be very familiar to you. If not, then there are two types of dorsal columns. Okay, number one, fasciculus cuneatus, and number two, fasciculus gracilis. Okay, now are they more familiar to you? They should be. Okay, they should be. Now, the dorsal columns, fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis, is going to conduct these first order neurons all the way to the medulla. Okay, where they will synapse right here. And where is right here? This is the nucleus cuneatus, as well as nucleus gracilis. Okay, if this fiber is running within the fasciculus gracilis, then it will synapse at the nucleus gracilis. While if this one is running within the nucleus cuneatus, it will run and synapse at the nucleus cuneatus. Okay, make sense? Okay, so now which fibers runs in the fasciculus cuneatus and which fibers run in the fasciculus gracilis? Very simple. Fibers that have come from the lower limb and lower part of the body is going to go with the fasciculus gracilis. Legs are graceful, and so because of that, fibers coming from the muscles of the leg, like for example the quadriceps, like for example the tibia anterior, those fibers are going to go within the fasciculus gracilis, while fibers from the upper limb and the upper part of the body all the way up to the neck is going to go within the fasciculus cuneatus. And that is why in lower segments of the spinal cord you will see only the fasciculus gracilis. But if you go up a little bit, to the middle of the thoracic cord, and above that, you will see the fasciculus cuneatus. Because why? Because the fasciculus cuneatus is only present in the upper part of the body. Okay? Make sense? Okay, so now you have the nucleus cuneatus, the nucleus gracilis over here. That is where the second part, the second neuron, the second order neuron is going to begin. Okay, and this second order neuron is going to cross over the opposite side. Okay, it will cross over the opposite side. All right, now imagine if you have another neuron like this. Okay, another neuron coming from the muscles on the opposite side. It's got to go like that, go through the fasciculus cuneatus or the fasciculus gracilis, going here, synapsing here, and then it will decussate. It will cross over to the other side. Okay, the fibers that are doing the crossovering, we call it the internal arcuate fibers. Okay, the internal arcuate fibers. Those are the fibers that are doing the crossing, the internal arcuate fibers. And then after that, these fibers are going to go up the brainstem, okay, as a bundle of nerves, okay, a bundle of nerve fibers. That is going to be called the medial lemniscus, okay, medial lemniscus. Okay, now, and this is also the reason why this decussation right here, this crossing over right here, is also called the lemniscal decussation. Okay, lemniscal decussation. And now, after you have gone through that, okay, after you have gone through that, then the medial lemniscus is going to get the fibers all the way to where? Where else? The thalamus. Okay, and it's going to go to the thalamus and synapse with third order neuron that will take it over to the somatosensory, primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, and where is this cortex again? Here. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is, even though in the spinal cord, in the brainstem, and even in the cerebral cortex, right? It is in the cerebrum, not cortex, because the cortex is the same. The superficial sensation and deep sensations are going to be carried by different tracks, different pathways within the brainstem, within the spinal cord. But when you get into the level of the cerebral cortex, they will go to the same area, right? Why? Because this is the primary somatosensory cortex. Do you see that there is a differentiation between deep somatosensory and superficial somatosensory here? No. They will go to the same area, right? The primary somatosensory cortex here. Okay? Very important that you understand that. Now, yes, so you have conscious deep sensation go to the cerebral cortex, especially to the primary somatosensory cortex here. And everything like this we have already talked about. Okay? So yes. Now, unconscious deep sensations, you don't have to know the exact pathway right now. Just know that there's only two neurons. One neuron coming from the receptor in the periphery and then going into the spinal cord, right? And then it will terminate at the posterior horn or the dorsal horn of the spinal gray matter. And the neuron number 2 is going to be coming from there, from the posterior horn, and project to the cerebellum, okay? Especially the mid part of the cerebellum, also called the cerebellum vermis. Okay, how? So that the cerebellum can use those information to calculate your next action. Okay, in order to do the next action, cerebellum will have to know. Okay, so where is your hand before the action, and then where is your hand going to be after the action ends? And so it is like a microcomputer. It will compute like the location between where your hand begins and where your hands end in order to find out a pathway from A to B. Okay. That is unconscious deep sensation. Okay? Yes. Finally, motor pathways. There are two motor pathways. There's a voluntary motor pathways, also called a pyramidal pathway, and the involuntary motor pathway, which is extrapyramidal. So these motor pathways, what will you do? What will they do? They will control your muscles. Okay? You can use your thoughts to control your muscles, right? Yeah, like you can control your bicep brachii, right? In order to raise your hand like this, right? So how do you do that? By using neurons from your cerebral cortex all the way down to your muscles in order to control that muscle. Okay? And how does it do that? Because of the voluntary motor pathway or the pyramidal pathway. Okay, but how about the involuntary motor pathway? You don't have to know a lot about involuntary motor pathway or the extrapyramidal pathway just yet. Just know that these pathway will control the movements of the muscles that are usually not like, not controlled by your cerebral cortex. Like, for example, the tone of the muscle. How is the muscle addressed? The muscle addressed will never really be placid, especially when you are awake, because there's always a muscle tone, right? A muscle tone within those muscles. If you mess with the tone, right, you will mess with the normal positioning of the body. Okay, so that is what extrapyramidal pathways does. It controls the tone, it controls the things that are normally not controlled by your cerebral cortex. But the voluntary motor pathway is what we're going to focus on, and it controls your actions. And how does it control your actions? Let me tell you. These two neurons, okay, this pathway, the voluntary motor pathway, will contain two neurons only. Okay, so very much unlike the sensory pathways, the motor pathway will contain two neurons. The first neuron is also called, okay, let me see here. So you got the voluntary motor pathway. Okay, motor pathway, voluntary motor pathway. Yes. And this pathway will have two neurons. Two neurons. Neuron number one is called the upper motor neuron. And this neuron is going to run within the CNS. Okay, upper motor neuron is the motor neuron that is going to run within the CNS only. Okay, and then you will have a lower motor neuron. Okay, lower motor neuron, and this one has a cell body within the CNS. But then, as the axon goes out, it goes out of the CNS to the muscles. Okay, so this lower motor neuron will relay signal to the muscles. Okay, so how do they work? How do they work? Now, let's begin once again with the diagram that we have already drawn so many times before. Brain, cerebral cortex, right? And then you have temporal lobe, and then you have the thalamus. Okay, do you have the thalamus over here? Okay, let's just draw it like that. Then you have midbrain, pons, medulla, and then finally spinal cord. Okay, spinal cord going down. Very good. Cerebellum, very good. So now, there are two neurons, right? There's an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron, or UMN and LMN. Okay, UMN and LMN. Now, you need to know where the UMN originates. Where is the upper one originate? Now, let's go back to this image right here, this diagram right here. Redraw it very, very quickly. This is your brain. Look from one side. Okay, temporal lobe. Here's the brainstem. Here's the cerebellum. Okay, so now remember, you have central sulcus. Okay, that separates the frontal and parietal. Then you have precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. What is the cortex at the postcentral gyrus called? The primary somatosensory cortex. We have already seen how it is receiving the somatosensation from both deep and superficial sensations before, right? So now, look at this one here. That one there is called the precentral gyrus. And the cortex area, the region, the gray matter surrounding the precentral gyrus is also called the primary motor cortex. It is here, it is from right here that different motor neurons are going to go down. Different upper motor neurons are going to go down, right? And go through the brainstem and then go through the spinal cord, okay, in order to get to your muscles and control your muscles. Now, how did that happen? So, just like the primary somatosensory cortex, different area here in the primary motor cortex, they will do different things, right? This area will control the legs, for example. This area will control the head and neck, right? This area here will control the arms, for example, right? Like, let's say we are trying to control the biceps brachii. So where should we go? Here, okay, here. This is the cell body of the upper motor neuron, okay? This is UMN cell body, okay? This is a motor neuron. So what will happen then? The UMN of the cell body is going to go down, okay? And when it goes down like that, okay, different UMNs from different places, okay, not just this place, is going to go down alongside of it, right? Alongside of it. We are just going to concern with this upper motor neuron right now, but you need to know that there are a lot of upper motor neurons that are going to go down alongside this, okay? So it makes kind of like a crown up top, right? It makes kind of like a crown up top. This one here, this structure right there, right? So what do we call that? We call that the corona radiata. And the corona radiata right there not only will contains the fibers of the upper motor neurons, it will also contain these fibers of the deep sensations, these fibers of the superficial sensations, as well as some other fibers as well. Okay, so corona radiata is a complex structure that is made of fibers that is downgoing the upper motor neuron, or it's upgoing, okay, from the deep sensation and superficial sensations pathways. Okay, so now the corona radiata is going to go down, right? So our neuron also is going to go down with it here. And then you'll have the thalamus. It doesn't go within the thalamus, guys. The thalamus concerns itself with the sensory, not motor. So where will it go? Here, look. Besides the thalamus, we will have these structures. And these structures are going to be the basal nuclei or the basal ganglia. And this part of the basal ganglia are going to be called the putamen and the globus pallidus. Okay, globus pallidus or globus pallidus. So this corona radiata is going to go in between the thalamus and the putamen and globus pallidus. Okay, it's going to go within these two structures. Okay, right? So this structure here, that is within, that is basically sandwiched within the thalamus and the putamen and globus pallidus. That structure right there, we call it the internal capsule. Okay, the internal capsule. And you will see that from here, these fibers are going to go anterior to the midbrain, also called the cerebral peduncles. Okay, and then it goes in the anterior surface of the pons, and then it goes down all the way to the medulla oblongata. And you can imagine neurons from this side also runs like this. Okay, corona radiata. Then you got the internal capsule. Then you got the peduncles. Okay, cerebral peduncles. Then you have the anterior surface of pons all the way to the medulla. Okay, then at the medulla, at the inferior most point of the medulla, something very interesting happens. 90%, okay, 90% of these fibers, okay, of these UMN's fibers are going to cross over to the opposite side. Okay, is going to cross over to the opposite side. Okay, so most of the fibers that are going to go down, okay, fibers that are going to go down and innervate the movements, okay, of the limbs, especially like arm muscles, like upper limb muscles and lower limb muscles, they are going to cross over. 90%, okay, of those fibers are going to cross over here. Okay, and we call that point the pyramidal decussation. Why? Because all of this tract right there, you call it the pyramidal tract. Pyramidal tract. Okay, and there are two types of pyramidal tracts. Number one is the cortical nuclear or cortical bulbar tracts that goes to the nuclei of the brainstem and control the movements of, like, for example, the eyes, the mouth, things like that, right? But then you will have another type that goes to the spinal cord. So you call it cortical spinal tracts. Okay, and these cortical spinal tracts are very, very important. Let's abbreviate it CST. Okay, so CSTs are going to be very, very important tracts, and before they become CSTs, 90% of the fibers are going to cross over at the brainstem, at the inferior most point of the medulla, at the pyramidal decussation, and those are going to be the muscles that those are going to be the fibers that are going to innervate the upper limb and lower limb muscles. Okay, and so those guys are going to run laterally. Okay, laterally within the spinal cord. So, like, let's say this is a segment of the spinal cord, right? Let's say this is a segment of the spinal cord right here. Okay, then you have, posterior median sulcus, anterior median fissure, central canal, gray matter, white matter. So where would it go? So this lateral cortical spinal tract is going to run right here. Okay, it's going to run right here. So lateral cortical spinal tract is going to run right here. Okay, the fibers are going to run right there. Okay, so that when it goes to the level, like for example this level here, where the bicep muscle is, usually around like C5, C6 level. Okay, C5, C6 level. This is way out of scale. Okay, this is way out of scale. Let's just imagine that this is all C's, right? So C5, C6, right? C5, C6. Then that it's going to synapse. Okay, our fiber is going to synapse with a lower motor neuron, and that lower motor neuron is going to go out, and it's going to go and innervates the biceps brachii muscle. So this one coming out of the spinal cord going to the biceps is going to be it's going to be the LMN, lower motor neuron. All of this is going to be upper motor neuron. And the upper motor neuron there is running within a tract that is called the lateral cortical spinal tract. Okay, lateral cortical spinal tract. And so the lateral cortical spinal tract will contain what? The UMNs that eventually going to control the LMNs that control the limb muscles, upper limb, lower limb muscles. Okay, so after this point, 90% of the fibers that goes to the lower motor neurons controlling the upper limb muscles and lower limb muscles have already crossed over. How about the other 10%? The other 10% do not cross over. Okay, they will just run anteriorly like this. Okay, they will just run anteriorly like this. Okay, they will run anteriorly like this. Okay, and so they will run where? They will run here. We call it the anterior cortical spinal tract. Okay, anterior cortical spinal tract. And this one does not cross over, or at least it does not cross over at the medulla, but it will cross over at the level where it will innervate the lower motor neuron. So it will cross over at the level where it will innervate the lower motor neuron. And then the motor neurons will form the lower motor neurons that goes out. These lower motor neurons will mostly go to the muscles of the trunk. Okay, muscles of the trunk. Like for example, the intercostal muscles, like for example, the erector spinae muscles and other muscles. Okay, not the muscles of the limb. The muscles of the limbs are mostly innervated by the fibers of the lateral cortical spinal tract. The fibers of the anterior cortical spinal tract are going to go and control the lower motor neurons that goes to muscles of the trunk. Okay, so these two are a little bit different than each other. Okay, so yes, that is the voluntary motor pathway. And here you can see this one there, that's your internal capsule. And as you can see, it is in between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus, which is basically the putamen and the corpus pallidus, as well as the head of the caudate nucleus right there. Okay, so that's the internal capsule. Okay, very good. And that is basically what we have said about before. And yes, that is it. Yes. Finally, for the involuntary motor pathways, it's called the extrapyramidal tract. Okay, there are many tracts like that. Okay, including the tectospinal tract, right? The vestibular spinal tract, the rubral spinal tract, and most of those guys will control most of the reflexes. Like for example, you see something and you want to move out of the way, right? You see something, like for example, you notice that, hey, there is feces, okay, down in the ground in front of you. So you want to change direction. Okay, and that is going to be going from the tectospinal tract and control your muscles, for example. And then you have rubral spinal tract and vestibular spinal tract, and those are going to help you in controlling your muscles in very, very hard situations. Like vestibular spinal tract is controlling your muscles when you are out of balance, so that you can get back to balance or something like that. And rubral spinal tract will control the tone. Right, like I said before, one very important component of the involuntary motor pathway, the extrapyramidal tract, is control of the tone. So if you activate these pathways, you can control the tone, you can control various reflexes that goes into your motor pathway. Okay, yes, and that's it. Thank you very much for sticking with me through this long. And this is the autonomic nervous system as well as some conduction pathways. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again in the practical portion of the class. Thank you and goodbye.